Hi, and welcome back to class, everybody. We're going to talk about the sexual response cycle today. But I'm going to start off with reading an excerpt from Sexy Origins and Intimate Things about orgasms. So, why does the orgasm exist? Is the little section I'm going to read from. Let's start. Men and women enjoy orgasms. I think that's fair. Do cats and dogs? Does a male fish like to ejaculate? Does a female fly enjoy being mounted? The simpler the creature, the more difficult it is to determine whether its sexual copulation is pleasurable, much less intensely orgasmic. Nonetheless, so many mammals court sex so aggressively, it must offer some pleasurable reward. Scientists use terms like estrus frenzy or ejaculatory reflex. Only for humans do we dare use orgasm, an interesting word. Orgasm derives from the Greek orgasmos, meaning to swell as if with moisture. Which is exactly what an excited penis does. It swells with blood. To the Greeks, orgasmos also meant lust. The Indo-European root of the Greek word is werg, to swell with sap or anger. The Sanskrit equivalent is urja, meaning violence and vigor, an apt description of copulation at the moment of climax. But the spelling orgasm, as we know it today in our language, entered English only around 1763. Interesting, huh? What a fun book. All right, so let me share my screen with you and we'll start this PowerPoint presentation. Let's do it. Oops, need to back up a little bit. How about there? All right. So like I said, we're going to talk about the physiology of sexual response, or the sexual response cycle. In this chapter, there's a lot to cover, but there's not a whole lot of subtopics. So we're going to talk about stage theories, and we'll start with the kind of original and or the classic, and then we'll talk about some revisions that were made later on, and we'll talk about physiology and psychology. Mostly in this chapter, we're going to talk about physiology. If you like to separate those things, I tend to think that physiology and psychology are not really things that you can separate because they interact and affect each other, consistently all the time. But we can look at these separately. And a lot of this chapter is going to focus on physiology. And then for a lot of our class, we move on from here. We will talk about more behavior, and we'll get into the psychology. Okay, but back to this idea that the book I read touched on, right? So for other animals and even, other primates, kind of like our distant cousins, right, that are out there, there's this term when the animals are, say, like sexually receptive, and it kind of comes in cycles, right? And it's called estrus, right? So it's when these organisms or these animals are physically and explicitly, it's obvious in non-human primates, when they're sexually receptive. For example, if you look at these apes here, these monkeys here, you can see the obvious swelling of the external genitalia, sending a visual cue, let alone all the kind of olfactory cues during estrus, but visual cues, right? And I think about, okay, well, what about these women here? Can you tell which of them are currently in estrus? Well, it's not really a term that we use anymore at all, right? To say when you're the most sexually receptive, because human females are receptive to sex during all stages of their ovulation cycle, even when they're not at their most fertile peak, right? And it might even seem counterproductive for women, um, to what do I want to say? Like biologically, it would make sense if you were kind of the most fertile when your behavior would match and you're trying to have a child, but ultimately for many women when they have sex, that is like not the goal. The goal is like not to have a child, is to enjoy sex for sex sake, and not just for procreation, right? You're enjoying it for other reasons, right? Maybe you're forming a bond, with your partner, and it brings you closer together, or maybe you just want to feel good for a while, right? Whatever it might be, but the goal is not always to have children. So we tend to reserve, that type of thinking for non-human types of animals. And then for us animals, right, things like estrus, and when you're the most sexually receptive, I mean, that's important if you're trying to have a child, but for like most women, that's not the goal, right? Every time they have sex anyway. Someone said like human females, they give off much more subtle cues, obviously, than the picture I had on the screen earlier. Physiological and behavioral cues, both of these when they are at their most fertile. And there's a video I want you to go watch that I've posted the modules that I think will be interesting to you about this kind of unique ability women seem to have, almost like an unconscious level that has to do with their olfactory systems and this idea of essentially being turned on by somebody else. And of course, there's also things like, rules of things like testosterone and attractiveness and dopamine and serotonin that play a large role in becoming aroused, right? So we'll talk about some of these ideas as we go through the chapter. Now, we're going to go back now and look at some of the pioneers here of this early sexual research. So on the left, you see sitting alone, we have Kinsey, this big grin on his face, right? And excuse me, Kinsey will come up again in a couple other chapters. For this chapter, not so much. We're going to talk more about Masters and Johnson over here, this couple sitting on the right, although that's some kind of, I bet they regret this photo. This is one of those where you go, man, that's the one they put in the textbook. That's the one in Getty Images, for example. Right? But nonetheless, their work is so groundbreaking. We got to talk about it. So in Masters and Johnson, they're a married couple, at this point. And what they did was they had people come into their labs and interested in the physiology of the sexual response cycle. So all of the work that on the sexual response cycle that we know about today is really on the shoulders of these two. I mean, they did amazing work, in the 1960s. They studied over 10,000 sexual response cycles when they were collecting their data. And they were looking for, what is a typical physiological response when it comes to arousal, right? So the participant was exposed to erotic stimuli and then was physiologically measured, with things like a penile strain gauge, which measures direct blood flow and dilation, plasmograph, blood flow, moisture, pressure, temperature. Right? They're looking for all of these types of changes that happen in people. And they wanted to see, is there a pattern? Like, is there a typical pattern to our human sexual response? And it turns out, yeah, they found one, right? So we're going to talk about that. They had a couple of big books when they were doing their work, and one was called Sex and Human Loving, and the other was called Human Sexual Response, and the other was called The Pleasure Bond. And they were studying the physiology of sexual response, but ultimately they wanted this to be used as part of a therapeutic technique to help couples, understand their bodies, understand the expectations, and the changes that they can expect, right, as they're going through a sexual response cycle. So they wrote a lot about the kind of function of sex, not just from a physiological standpoint, but also how it can help be, the knowledge can help keep couples together and keep couples satisfied and learn how to communicate, about what they're experiencing in their own bodies, that type of thing, right? So kudos to them, right, for doing what seems like basic research, like understanding how our bodies work, and then using that in a practical application, right, to help people in their relationships. So I'm a little enamored with these two. I think they were just fascinating. I think their work was pretty amazing. Okay, so let's look at their model, right? Their model for the typical patterns in the human sexual response cycle go in this order, right? It's called the EPOR model for short. That's an acronym which stands for excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. And so I'm going to show you a couple graphs here. And the first one, and don't worry, we're going to talk about these 4 steps in their cycle in more detail. That's really what was the majority of this chapter is made up of, going through the 4 stages of the EPOR model. So a typical sexual response cycle for men looks something like this, right? So the typical one is in green, right? So you can see, though, I know we haven't talked about what these are yet, but we're going from excitement, right? And so you have this like ramping up of excitement, very quick, very steep, right? So it means really, really fast going from kind of homeostasis to sexually excited. So becoming aroused, right? And then going into this plateau stage where you can see it kind of levels off for a bit. Leveling off is a weird way to think about it when the excitement level is so high. It's more like, yeah, it's leveling off. It's more like you're maintaining this high level of arousal, right? So you're maintaining this high level of arousal until there's another big, huge spike, to orgasm, and then just a steep drop off as you go through this resolution stage, kind of back to homeostasis or like balance, before you were aroused. So pretty quick, and not a whole lot. I mean, there's diversity, but not as much as you might think for men. For some men, you can see there's this extra blue line here that's dashed. And for some men, that meant they go through this resolution stage, and then really quickly they're up to really high arousal levels. Not much of a plateau, but they can have a second orgasm. Pretty rare, right? In the 10,000 cycles that they studied, that men could have two orgasms, but it wasn't impossible. Um, Interestingly enough, typically only one of these orgasms involved the ejaculation of semen, right? So one of these is typically if a male can have two, really, really quickly. They're like, or what we think of as multiple orgasms. Then one of them is usually what they might call like a dry orgasm, where there isn't ejaculation. They get all like the muscle spasms and everything that comes along with that, physiologically, but just not ejaculation both times, which is interesting, right? It's not like, half one time and half the other. It looks like that's not really the way the physiology works for men. But interesting, right? So there's some diversity there. Now let's look at the women's cycle, right? So in this case, right, you can tell already that there's more diversity. There's definitely differences for women. One of them kind of looks like the men's cycle. So the same thing, if we look at the green one here, is very similar to the men's cycle. The plateau is a bit longer, and then you can't really tell on this graph very well, but the excitement to plateau stage tends to not be as steep. It looks just as steep in this one, but slightly not quite as steep. And then the plateau kind of stays, so maintaining that high arousal level. Often for women, like a long period of time. Sadly enough, for lots of women, their cycle looks more like this red one here, right? Or just never achieving orgasm at all, right? That's the red one. So they get this high level of excitement, and then you can see it kind of fluctuates, kind of dipping slightly in and out, where it feels like, oh my gosh, we're about to take off the orgasm, and then you just don't quite get there, right? So that was extremely common. That's B, but the most common is A, right? So A looks very similar to the men's cycle. You can even see there's a second stage here for some women that can have multiple orgasms, right? And then you have a sharp drop off into resolution again. Um, but for women, they can become excited again and again and again. And that refractory period is what's called. It's a period between, say, like orgasm and then arousal level. They can achieve that typically over and over. Where men, there's a lot of diversity in how quickly they become aroused again. And then there's some women we'll talk about in later chapters who it's common for them to every time they have sex to have multiple orgasms. And it's what's interesting about that is the criticism they get from other women who think they're making it up or they're lying, right? That kind of thing. But we'll talk about them in a different chapter. For some other women too, you have this blue line. This one is an interesting one. It's like you have these mini plateau areas. So you get a burst of excitement and then not much higher, like an intensity again. And spend a little time in that low, almost like a shelf, right? So you maintain this like moderate level of excitement, and then you get like a little level again, and you maintain that moderate level of excitement. It's not a long plateau, and it's not at the height of excitement, right, of intensity, but you might get like a few of those. Feels like you're kind of being pushed up in waves, right, until like that orgasmic type of release, and then you know quick drop off into resolution. They have the fastest, the fastest you can see here in these sexual response cycles if they kind of linger and stop and kind of start in the first stage of excitement. Pretty interesting stuff, huh? So you look, yes, there are patterns there that they found in different types of people, not just in just male and female, but all different types of people and different types of sexual experiences that they've had. They found the same type of cycle with some like very few exceptions, which we kind of put them in their own category of kind of atypical, right? So these are like the typical or average sexual response cycles. So let's look at these stage at a time. Let's look at excitement first. That's a diagram for you if you weren't ready for this chapter. Here we go. So the E stands for excitement. I'm going to feel like a cheerleader in this chapter. E is for excitement. Go team. All right. So, oops. So E, the term here, now let's only have one bit of terminology on this PowerPoint. The word I want you to know for excitement is vasocongestion, right? And remember, this is the physiology. We're talking about the physiology of the sexual response cycle. We're not talking about like your thoughts and emotions so much. We're talking about like what's happening in your body, right? So we get vasocongestion, which really just means an increase in blood pressure, right? That's what it comes down to. But what that looks like, right, for males is the erection, right? The erect penis, which is really like the pooling of blood in the penis. And there's a valve that prevents the blood from exiting, which causes the erection, right? So you have this collection of blood, which is really being absorbed and housed by spongy tissues called the corpora cavernosa and the corpus spongiosum that are on the inside of your penis, right? And then, of course, the scrotum itself has a kind of a typical physiological response to excitement where it starts to tighten up and testicles kind of elevate closer kind of into the body, right? They become more taut, if you want to use the word for that, right? So it just means they're kind of being sucked in, kind of pressed against or closer to the body, right? While the penis is becoming erect. Okay, now for women, when it comes to vasocongestion, some other things happen as well. Like, it's still same idea about, what do we do with this blood flow? Like all of a sudden, this extra blood flow to your, reproductive organs, right? So for women, the clitoral glands and shaft are going to become erect from this increased blood flow. Just like the penis, right? We talked about them being kind of similar, in previous chapters. So these clitoral glands in the shaft of the clitoris itself, which now we know to be much larger, than previously thought. Same thing, are swelling with blood, and the clitoris becomes more visible. So the glands of the clitoris, you can see as the hood of the clitoris kind of retracts during this excitement stage. So it retracts, kind of revealing the glands of the clitoris. And also, you could expect that the labia minora will increase in size, and usually that will cause them, the kind of, you want to put crudely, the lips, right, to separate from each other. Also, right, not only does the clitoris swell, the labia minora swells. It's not as exaggerated as those primate pictures I put at the beginning of the slideshow, but that's what humans have right there, right? That's the swelling to this excitement. Internally, though, the first inner third of the vagina will start to expand and the vaginal walls lubricate, right? Okay, now we can talk about the breasts as well. That's interesting. Like really, really interesting things actually happen to the breasts during this excitement stage. You have like fatty deposits is really, what you have in your breast tissue, right? And a few things happen when you become excited. These fatty deposits kind of shift a bit, and the breasts become fuller, which also makes them more symmetrical. Because typically, women's breasts and men's breasts too, if they get large enough, are not symmetrical. Like one's bigger than the other, right? One hangs a little lower than the other, that kind of thing. But during the excitement stage is when they're the most symmetrical. Interesting. This becomes more apparent when you are older, right? But there you have it, right? Kind of interesting. So the breast size increases. Of course, nipples can become erect. The vasocongestion also makes like veins more distinct, within the breast tissue. The areola itself, so the tissue that's surrounding the nipple, the darker tissue there, can actually increase in size and makes the nipple appear a little less erect. And what's really interesting is when you go from like the excitement stage in toward like the plateau, and then right up into the orgasm stage, you can see the sex flush kind of intensify, so on the breast, and they actually become hotter. Like the temperature goes up on this part of the body in particular. Um, that's if they're being like directly stimulated or not, right? So that's interesting. So sex flush can appear. I got a picture of that on the next page that you might find interesting. But not just on the breast. You can see it on kind of the abdomen. You'll see it on the chest, even up into your neck. Some people get a flush on their face as well. And then, after orgasm, or after at least arousal levels diminish, if you don't reach orgasm, since we're talking about women, um, for men, that's almost always where a sexual kind of act kind of ends, or at least, it's typical for men to reach orgasm. But for women, if you do, you can see this happen rapidly. If you don't achieve orgasm, then a little bit slower, you'll get a detumescence, which is the blood, retreating, moving away from the breasts, and you can see changes in the areola and nipples, right? And disappearance of that sex flush, and kind of decreasing in size again, and nipples becoming less erect. Okay, so here's a picture of that sex flush I was talking about. Right, so when the sex flush is happening, this, by the way, I should explain. So this picture, it comes from a series of an art installation, right? So if you went to this museum, it was a museum, and they had a whole exhibit on different types of sexual art, right? So there's one photography exhibit I found pretty interesting, was that they have women who were either masturbating or receiving oral sex from somebody, and all they took pictures of was like they're trying to just get their faces, what this was all about. But what I thought was interesting when I was looking at all these pictures of these women who were part of this, right, like they're models or they're actors who are doing this, was that what was really cool was that they didn't all look like models or supermodels. It looked like, I guess we would call like regular people, right? That was kind of cool. But what they didn't talk about at all in the installation was that you can see the obvious like stages, well, maybe not so obvious, but you can imagine the the stages of physiological arousal as a cycle, and you could see it in the pictures, and you could especially see the sex flush, during orgasm. So in this picture here, the top left, this is before they started, right? The top right, this is the excitement stage. And they kind of skipped right to the orgasm here in the bottom left. You can see how red she is everywhere, right? That's that sex flush. And then you can see it starting to diminish in the resolution stage. So pretty interesting there, that this was captured in an art piece, like almost like unintentionally, right? But you can see the sex flush there. Yeah, so you can see even in the picture, you can see like the superficial veins that becoming more visible. Some like swelling in the chest and neck, and general like pinkness in the skin. Everything seems kind of like more puffy during this excitement, right? Okay, so let's say, all right, in this sex act, we're going past the excitement stage, and we're getting into the plateau stage. But the way I just said that doesn't really make a lot of sense, because you're not getting past the excitement. Like right now, you're like peak excitement that you're not going to see until orgasm, and you're just like maintaining that excitement level in this plateau, right? So the P in the EPOR model is for plateau. It's like I said, the peak level excitement. You stay there for a while, but there are still some changes to expect. So I thought we could talk about some of these changes. Okay, last time we started with men's. We'll start with men again. For men, something we talk about, you can see it right at the beginning here, or right at the top of this picture. We have the Cowper's gland secretions. But if you look down lower down here, you can see the Cowper's glands themselves and where they are relative to other, reproductive areas and organs in the reproductive system for men. Okay, so for the Cowper's glands, they're going to secrete fluid at the end of this plateau phase, like right before orgasm, right? And once you get the plateau phase, it's a lot less likely that the erection will be lost. We can say that too. So you get like secretion of fluid from the Cowper's glands. Some people call that, pre-cum, right? Sometimes it can have living sperm cells in it. Um, so yes, it's possible, that you can get pregnant from pre-cum. The probability is lower, of course, but it's possible if you were wondering about that. What else can we say about the plateau stage for men? Like I was just about to say, it's a lot less likely that the erection will be lost during the plateau stage. Like during the excitement stage, erection can be lost by things like distractions or whatever it might be, something emotional, anxiety, whatever it is, right? But during the plateau stage, if you get there, a lot harder to lose. Like if someone comes and like knocks on your door, during the excitement stage, it's still like, ooh, we're about to get caught. Well, unless you like it, right? And then but that's the excitement stage. If you get to the plateau stage, then in that case, someone knocks on the door and it's not going away, right? That erection is there, ready to be used. Okay, we can also say in this picture, you can see the corona or the head of the penis, and it's going to also become engorged with blood in the plateau stage. Like, the swelling that you will see is during the plateau. Which kind of makes sense. It's right before you get to that stage of like no return as far as like ejaculation goes. So the swelling is, the most intense, the most engorged. The testicles now have been pulled like as tight as they're going to get up against the body. And so the scrotum becomes at this point like very thick because it's pulled all of its skin together and it's lifting the testicles up, right? Okay, now the plateau stage for women, let's talk about that. This is pretty interesting too. So for women, wait, can we see it here? Yeah, we'll come back to that idea in a sec. Okay, so for women, the clitoral glands at this point actually retract back under the clitoral hood, right? So it seems a little weird to say they just retract, but there's some retraction from the actual clitoral glands itself. There's actually some more like elongation of the clitoral hood. So either way, I think, the point might be here for this retraction because during this stage, it might be too intense. Like it would be so intense that it's counterproductive to reaching orgasm, right? Like you can't take the intensity of it. You need to like back off a little bit, most women would say. Okay, so that's why this is sad, but that's why in those cultures where they do practice things like genital mutilation, where they end up actually removing the clitoral hood, right? A lot of people think they just cut your clitoris off. Sometimes that happens, but most often it's the removal of the clitoral hood, and that actually makes sex less pleasurable for women, like I said, because of too much stimulation. Your peak arousal, the clitoris would retract kind of naturally, so that you don't get that direct stimulation anymore. So during also, just like with the excitement stage, you get continued labia minora darkening as more blood is accumulating there. Let me see. Do I have? Nope, not yet. We can also say, okay, for the women, we've got there's glands called the Bartholomew's glands. And I mentioned them in the previous chapters. They're little openings on the side of the vagina. They're very small, right? And like, a bit smaller even than the urethral opening. And it used to be thought like that these were the sources of vaginal lubrication, like that's where lubrication came from. But it was Masters and Johnson who actually collected fluids from these glands, and they realized this is like a tiny drop, in the lubrication bucket, right? Not nearly enough for the type of lubrication that would create pleasurable sex, right? I think I mentioned in the last chapter too, like if you've ever, I don't mean to be crude, but if you ever performed oral sex on a woman and you notice like a taste changes right before you get to orgasm, that's because of the secretions of these Bartholomew's glands, right? It's because of these fluids. It's actually like it's a pre-orgasmic release. Don't think about it that way. It's pre-orgasmic. Okay. Let's talk internally. And keep the same picture here. The upper third of the vagina, in this case, fully expands in a process called tenting, right? And I'm gonna go back on the slideshow for a second here because it was hard for me to find a good picture of a tenting uterus. Um, but here's kind of the idea. You see the arrows there, like they're showing that, here's the prone position of the uterus, and during the plateau stage, you actually see it kind of gets pushed up. These ligaments and muscles actually move the uterus up, and all this swelling going on here actually pushes on the uterus as well, and so it goes up and tense up that way. You say it gets lifted. That sounds better, right? So there's a significant amount of space, there. And during the plateau phase, it's much less likely that the penis would actually be able to hit the uterus anymore. Sometimes that happens. A penis or object that's inserted, if that's what you do during sex, it is possible to hit the cervix, the opening of the uterus. Some women actually report that they like that sensation, but most women don't, right? But for most women who have sex with men without any types of objects, they don't usually have to worry about it. Let's see. What else can we say? I guess we could say a woman's uterus is. I guess you could say this on that note that I was just talking about. I was kind of making a joke, but honestly, on that note, woman's uterus is being hit by a man's penis. That's probably a sign that she's not actually fully aroused, right? So a little backing off at that point, more foreplay can sometimes cause the uterus to lift up, right, and to create that space. Sometimes when that happens, some air gets trapped within the uterus or within the vagina, the cavity itself, and it can actually be, it's kind of, the air can be squeezed out. Some people call it queefing, and a lot of people get embarrassed by that, right? They get embarrassed by this expelling of air. It's actually really good that you expel that air, because the last thing you want to do is get it caught in there, and for things to go wrong, to actually get a blood clot can be dangerous, but that's pretty rare. What's more typical is the queefing sensations. But I would say, like, don't be embarrassed by that. I mean, we should change that somehow, right? Like the queefing should sound like yes, you should be like celebrating, like we're going from the excitement stage now into plateau stage. It's just a function, right? It's just like the byproduct of a fully functional, aroused vagina and uterus, right? Nothing to be embarrassed about. But also during the plateau stage, like I mentioned, the sex flush continues to spread up the chest now, typically, moving from like just the breast, but up the chest toward the neck. And with further arousal, once you're at this plateau phase, the sex flush could be even like reaching up to your like clavicles, your collarbones, and usually starts to also spread down the abdomen. So it kind of starts in the middle and kind of moves its way out, right? Which is called proximodistal, if you want to know what they call that type of trend, but you don't have to know that word. All right, let's move on now. Let's talk about orgasms, shall we? We'll talk a bit about, I think I already mentioned this somewhat, multiple orgasms, emission, ejaculatory, inevitability, expulsion, and afterglow, like all these things that are associated, with the orgasm. First, like the multiple orgasms thing, for men, like I said, it was extremely rare. Like people that study this, in the laboratory, what they find is that if men can have multiple orgasms, it's usually two and not more than that. And only one of those is there any like semen ejaculated. So there's usually only ejaculation at all with one of them, right? Um, for women, women potentially can have multiple orgasms. Most women, though, when they do have multiples, it's somewhere around the range of 2 to 4, with most of them being on the lower side, like the 2 to 3. More than that is atypical, but there are some women out there we'll talk about later, other chapters, who every time they have sex, they have anywhere between like 12 to 25 orgasms, right? But there's something special about like them too. Like they have something else in common, like in their physiology and kind of their psychology. So we'll talk about that in chapters coming up. Um, the emission stage is really like when you're going from plateau and you're just starting to move up, like kind of ramping up into the orgasm stage. Like you're moving toward orgasm, right? You think of the orgasm as like the expulsion stage, but emission feels like, when you get to that point where you're like, oh my God, it's going to happen. If you've had sex, and you might feel that sensation, or even masturbating, right? You're like, oh my God, it's going to happen. And then the next stage is usually like, there's no coming back from this now. That's the ejaculatory inevitability stage. And this is kind of like, male centric language, because not every woman ejaculates, right? And then after that, though, like when you get like, there's no turning back. That's the inevitability part. Like this is going to happen. Someone knocks on the door, the phone rings, or whatever. Like it's not going to stop, this orgasm from occurring. And then you get to the expulsion stage, and that's like the orgasm itself. And then you have what happens afterward, right? The afterglow. These are kind of the language that, you'll hear sex researchers use to talk about orgasms. Oh, but here's something interesting. So we're going to talk about some similarities and differences for men and women when they achieve, I shouldn't say that. It sounds wrong. Like when they experience orgasm. But one thing that's interesting is that even though like the physiology of what's happening is a bit different and your experiences may be a bit different, when men and women express what it feels like to have an orgasm, it is really tough to figure out. If you can't hear their voice, if you're just reading it in text, you can't figure out really if it was a man or a woman. And I thought, you don't believe me? Let's play a game. So we're going to play a game called Name That Orgasm. There we go. Kind of rushed through that. So I'm going to put this text on the screen and I'll read it to you. And, these are quotes from people describing their orgasms. And you can just tell me, do you think this came from a man or a woman, right? And there's a bunch on here, but I'm not going to read them all to you. I think you'll get the gist pretty quickly. Okay, so here's the first one. Orgasm starts as a warm sensation in the center of my body, and it spreads in waves and reaches the extent of my full body as it increases in intensity. It's like an earthquake of pleasure that fills my body with the best energy ever and slowly dissipates and leaves me drained and happy. So now I would ask you, who do you think said that, a man or a woman? Just go with your gut. What do you think, man, woman? Let's see if you were correct. This was April Flores, who is an adult film star. Okay, so this is a woman. Okay, let's try another one. So this one is, it's a long one. It feels like the onset of a dire need at the very same moment that it's being fulfilled in slow motion, like a voracious, mind-shattering thirst, just as a waterfall begins to surge down toward you from above, like a tickle that creeps up from every corner of your body until you're desperate for it to stop, and also to continue forever, as if squeegees are scraping through your limbs, like a gunshot, startling and discreet, leaving you with vibrations, the trembling steel, the blowback. So do you think a man said that or a woman said that? That's pretty damn descriptive. So if you're showing your sexist bias, you would say there's no way a man said that with his dumb man brain, right? But let's see who. Maybe you're right. I don't know. Let's see who said this. Oh no, that was Bob MacArthur, and he's a dentist. I threw that in there because the survey where I found this, they have their professions listed as if that really mattered. It makes it funny to me. So that was Bob MacArthur, a very descriptive expression of what an orgasm feels like. All right, let's try it. This is kind of fun. Let's do a couple more. Oh, this is a shorter one. I feel like I'm being tickled softly by a feather on the inside, and then the feeling becomes more intense until it all culminates into a fireworks display that explodes out through my body. What do you think, man or woman? That is a woman. So that's Amelie, who is a magazine editor. And then we got this one. How about when it comes, it feels like being on the best drugs ever on a roller coaster. That sounds kind of fun. Let's see. That was Aiden Starr, adult film star. That's a woman, right? I had to look that one up. I was like, I don't know who that is, but that's a woman. Okay. And then we've got, why not? This one, it says it kind of transcends a pure physical feeling. It's like a whole body and mind numbness, where for a few brief seconds, you strangely feel both helpless yet in complete control, mentally vacant, while the entirety of your tactile sense rushes to a single point of exit. Interesting. Single point of exit. That might make you feel like this is a man saying it, but I don't know. Let's see. Who is it? Yeah, it was Matt. It was good old Matt, the psychologist. We can go on and on, right? There's so many of these. Stephen, who's a horticulturalist, Cassandra, the office operations manager, right? And so on. But it's really hard to tell whether the person is a man or a woman who is, being quoted here. It's really, really tough to tell. So I'm just going to skip through these because I have a whole bunch, but it would be boring if I read them all to you. So the point there is that it's hard to describe orgasms, and it's really hard as well to figure out who's doing the describing when you're just reading. Okay, so let's talk about the O and the EPOR model, the orgasm itself. So for men, physically, right, you're getting contractions of the scrotum, and then the vas deferens will propel semen out of the penis. But also, as contractions will occur in what are called the pelvic muscles. So those are the perineal muscles that are in the area between the scrotum and the rectum, and they contract, right? So you're getting all these muscle groups, pulsing essentially. The rectum also contracts, and there's a general sense of like all the muscles kind of twisting and twitching and contracting, and they might actually extend like even all the way out into like other parts of your body. Like it feels like they're even in your toes and your legs sometime, or even your out to your arms and your fingers. Like those are amazing, right? You feel like, man, I felt that orgasm in my toes. Like, oh wow, right? Okay, so for women, as far as like muscles contracting, it's very similar, right? But we can say for women, the clitoris is going to retract into the hood during orgasm, so you're not going to get all those. It retracts, but you're also going to get all the same like pelvic muscles, sphincter muscles, but then you got the urethral sphincter muscles all contracting as well. So again, a lot of muscle groups contracting. I believe I had. Let me look at my notes over here. So one time I feel like I wrote down how many contractions per second. Maybe I'll run into that in my notes as I'm looking at them here. Okay, but anyway, so whoops, I didn't switch. Sorry about that. So for the women, right, we get all these muscle groups here. You can see that contract, right? The uterus contracts, the outer vagina contracts, the sphincter muscles contract, right? The clitoral hood is covering up the clitoris. The glands or the head of the clitoris has retracted under the hood, and all these pelvic muscles over here, these are contracting as well. So the vagina will contract the outer part, not the upper third, that tented, but instead the lower third, during orgasm. And then the most powerful source of the orgasmic sensation for women tend from the contractions of the uterus. So for women, if they have their uterus removed, one of the biggest losses they report is that they feel like the orgasms aren't as intense as they once were, because so much of the sensation comes out of the contractions of the uterus itself. But what's really interesting about male versus female orgasm is that the sensations are very similar because our bodies are made out of very similar tissues and muscles, right? So it makes sense to me in that little game I was showing you earlier about who's describing the orgasm here, male or female, why they're so similar, is because similar physical sensations, right? Masters and Johnson found that these muscles in the pelvic region, they pulse on average. Oh, here it is. Good. Okay, I found my notes down here. They they pulse on average like 8 to 12 times with an orgasm, right? And but it's like intense because all of them like working together, right? And then the average contraction of these muscles is about 8/10 of a second long. It's like really, really short, right? So orgasm can be pretty brief, but there's still 8 to 12 individual contractions that each last just under a second, right? So we're talking like anywhere from like 8 to 12 seconds long. Interesting, huh? Okay, what else can we say? We'll get to that in a second. As far as like males and females having multiple orgasm, um, I'll just say it again. I know I mentioned it already, but the trick is that males who had multiple orgasms only ejaculated once on one of those orgasms. Some men could have an ejaculation on the first one and then have like a follow-up orgasm that didn't include ejaculation. That was the most common when men could have multiple orgasms. Like they ejaculated in the first one, they could have a second one, and they would get muscle contractions, but you know, no expulsion of seminal fluids. But the key thing that Masters and Johnson noticed is that men could have multiple orgasms, but they couldn't have these multiple ejaculations. Let's see. As far as like areas of the brain are concerned, so one thing your book doesn't talk a whole lot about in this part of the chapter, which I find kind of strange, is like what's going on in the brain, because there have been some studies now where using functional, MRI technology, they'll look at males and they'll look at females and what's going on in their brains while they're having an orgasm. These men and women have to be trained, by the way, if you're curious about that, to be able to keep their heads and most of their bodies pretty dang still while they're having these orgasms, so the MRI can actually read their brains while it's going on. Very interesting, right? Pretty hard to orgasm, like when you're stuffed inside of a tube where they can look at your brain, right? But what they find is that there's activity in like over 30 discrete regions of the brain. So just like, and especially for women, like for men's brains, there's, these 30 areas, but for women, there's that plus, right? It almost looks like the whole brain lights up. If you look at it visually, actually look at the scan, you can see it's like much more intense activation for women than for men. But what's going on, like chemically, then is a flood of dopamine, right? Kind of like that anticipatory and then like feel good type of chemical in your body. A lot of oxytocin gets released. And we know that oxytocin is important in kind of like bonding, forming bonds with other people. Um, Mothers with their newborn babies are releasing oxytocin, and when they breastfeed, they're producing just immense amounts of it. Anytime they're holding their children, men do too, just holding their own babies, which is interesting. Holding babies in general does it to both men and women, but even more intense when it's your own. So that's pretty interesting, right? Kind of makes sense that sex would have this kind of, chemically have this kind of like a chemical that's correlated with that human bonding. Other things that are interesting happen, like something called the lateral orbitofrontal cortex gets turned off, essentially. You don't have to remember all that, but if you're curious, the lateral orbitofrontal cortex. This is the part of the brain like correlated with things like self-evaluation, reason, control. Also shuts down like fear and anxiety centers, which is interesting. And then you get lots of, I'm gonna say, like relaxation of the amygdala and the hippocampus. So like reducing emotional kind of sensation and interpretation, and especially for aggressiveness, like what we associate with aggressiveness right after orgasm, that kind of goes away. Those were particularly strong for men. Now, all those things I just mentioned happen for men and women. The things I just mentioned were more profound for men, and then for women, though, it didn't stop there. It was like, it's more like what region of the brain is not active during an orgasm. Amazing, right? Let's see. Now I'm going to talk about Do you want to go this far yet? Oh, yeah. Do I want to? Ejaculation. Yeah, why not, right? I think we talked about male ejaculation. We should talk about like female ejaculation. So, for women, most women don't ejaculate, so there's no issue of like a refractory period, after orgasm, where you have to kind of get all your mechanisms for ejaculation in place again, so that the multiple orgasm was seen more frequently among women, but not in all women, right? Of course, not all women, have like that experience, but then some women have, on the other end of the spectrum, have like multiple orgasms every time they have sex, right? But the focus here typically is on something called the Skene's glands. And there's some debate about the Skene's glands actually being like the G spot itself. Now, here's the thing. You'll read sometimes and you'll hear other sex researchers say things like there is definitely a G spot, and you'll hear others say it's a myth. But the research shows in like meta-analyses where they're looking at just like essentially like physical mapping of the body, is that they find a lot of variation, right? That's what they find. Lots of variation. So let me just read a few things to you here about female ejaculation in the G spot. So what brings us to the issue of female ejaculation is what is oftentimes referred to as the G spot, right? So like your book seems to really believe in the G spot, but I have to say it's still a topic of debate, right? Your book will say like, without a doubt, there is one, or that kind of thing. I've two other textbooks on my shelf behind me that say this is a total myth and it's made up, and they're printed, like 1 year apart from each other. So what that should tell you is like there needs to be more research on this if we actually care about this topic. We need to go into more depth. But here's some things we can say. It's a topic of debate whether there is a G spot and whether it is something called the Skene's glands, which most of the research now points to. But it's not really clear that it exists in all women, and that could explain why some women ejaculate and some women don't, right? Perhaps. Or why for some women you can kind of find this Grafenberg spot or G spot, and for some women it doesn't seem to matter, right? It doesn't seem like there's anything there, right? And no matter how much you look for it, you don't find it, right? So when there is something, a Grafenberg spot or a G spot, it's about 1/3 of the way into the vagina. And in the picture I have on this screen, this person's looks like their kind of middle finger, right, is actually touching, and where here it says Skene's glands and erectile tissue. Well, that would also be the G spot, right? Same place. It's about 1/3 of the way into the vagina. It's on the front side. Something called the Skene's glands, and there's erectile tissue that may be present in some women, but in some women not present at all, right? And then for some women, it's there, but it's not pronounced, right? So there's like a whole spectrum. And some people call this the female prostate gland, and it may in fact be the prostate, right, that didn't completely degenerate, and that may be what this G spot is for a large portion of women. It was there and it totally degenerated, before they were sexually active, and for other women, it's still degenerating, and for other women, it's not degenerating quickly at all, and it's still there. And so they have the same tissues that you find, or very similar tissues that you would find in the male prostate gland, still a part of the reproductive system, and they secrete the same fluids, which is interesting. The fluids from the Skene's glands are very similar to the fluids that are secreted by the male prostate gland. So that leads me to think that, at least that explanation makes the most sense to me, that it is like a degenerating prostate gland, right? It's been degenerating since you were in the womb in your mother, right? All right. So it's thought that the Skene's glands, or this G spot, may be present in half women, and then some other estimates say 2/3 of women, right? They have some form of tissue there making up the Skene's glands. In 2013, there was a meta-analysis of these studies, and they were examining, this issue of female ejaculation, and what they found was, and this has nothing to do with just like the G spot or the Skene's glands, just ejaculation in general, right? So when there's a study, meta-analysis, by the way, is like where they collect data on one topic from like multiple studies and compile it all together, and then do a statistical analysis of that data. And when they did this in 2013 on this issue of female ejaculation, they found that in these studies there was a huge range, like from saying things like 10% of women ejaculate all the way up to 54% of women that ejaculate. That's a massive range, right? Like a 44, percentage range. That's ridiculous, right? So that means that we probably just need more data on this topic, right? Somebody needs to do, if we want to know the answer to this, then we just have to do more research. Also, though, what's interesting in that same study was that when there is ejaculation, when they actually measured the amount of that ejaculation, again, humongous range. That was from 1 milliliter, 1 milliliter to 900 milliliters, which is almost a full liter of fluid, right? So from like 1 milliliter to almost nearly a liter of fluid. So again, like humongous range. So there's a lot of variation in things like, whether women may, do or do not have, Skene's glands or a G spot, and then if they can or can't ejaculate, and if they can ejaculate, huge amount of variation, in how much. So, and then how, right? So some women who actually do ejaculate will say it comes as like a big burst all at once, or sometimes in a series of small bursts. And you might call that squirting, right? And then the question becomes like, well, what is in that fluid? Is it urine? And typically it's not urine, right? Some women, when they ejaculate, there is there is a loss of bladder control, but that's not most women. For the most women that ejaculate, I mean like the vast majority of women that have been studied who can ejaculate and they collect their fluids, they don't find urine. Even like, like if they do, it's like minuscule traces of it, which is probably, just secreted out, due to all the orgasm muscle constrictions, but, what do I want to say? Not coming from the bladder, just left, in the urinary tract. So we can say that female ejaculate contains proteins that are very similar to the male prostate secretions, same fluids, right? Just lending more support that the underdegenerated prostate kind of hypothesis. Squirting is not a loss of bladder control typically. And, because during the plateau phase, the bladder is usually prevented from expelling urine. So it's very, very difficult to do that. I suppose you could train yourself to, if you really wanted to. Last thing I want to say about this idea about like the G spot and whether women, have one or not, or why there would be variation. It's like FYI, right? Sometimes when people who have sex with women, when they find out that this, exists for some women and it may exist for the woman they're having sex with, they can become very goal oriented, right? Like they want to find this spot in their partner, this like mysterious structure. And they think, that female ejaculation would, or they think that like female ejaculation would be like evidence of sexual satisfaction, like it might be for a man, right? Like a male ejaculation. But it's not, it's not quite the same thing. Some women who have ejaculated feel bad about it, right? They don't like that they do that. They don't like that they ejaculate. Some who don't ejaculate feel like they should, but they aren't. But I would say, like, bottom line, I wouldn't make finding a G spot or ejaculating a goal. Sometimes when you have like goal directed sex like that, it's like you're setting yourself up for, self-conscious emotions and like guilt and shame and that kind of thing. So, I wouldn't make it a goal. And besides, remember, variation. It's nothing to feel guilty about. It's more like, if you think about it in physiological terms, if you're like, I don't have a G spot and you're pissed about it, just think like, okay, am I, one of my physiological sex organs were forming in utero, my prostate is fully degenerated. Does that make you feel bad that you have a totally degenerated prostate? No, because you don't really need one, right? Like, who cares, right? Or if it didn't completely degenerate, whatever, doesn't seem to be harming your function, and you get a little extra pleasure out of it. Okay, like either way, it's just variation, right? There it is. But yeah, I would say if you're a person who has sex with women, and you can't find the G spot and it's getting to a point of like frustration or negative emotion, stop, chill out. Like, don't make that your goal. Or if the woman you're with doesn't ejaculate and you think like, oh, I'm not a very good lover, it's like, some women don't ejaculate at all. And then some women who do don't like it. So, communicate with your sexual partners. Okay. Let's move on to the last stage of Masters and Johnson's EPOR model. And this is the refractory period. So, sorry, not refractory, resolution. It's easy to get those two confused. So R is for resolution. And this is where blood starts to flow back into the regular bloodstream and everything starts to kind of return back to where it had been before arousal and excitement. So for males, they when they endure the refractory period after ejaculation, they can't have another ejaculation, really, no matter how much stimulation they receive. Like, it's like not going to happen, right? For women, you see the sex flush, you start to diminish. There's a period of time where it takes to sort of return back to your normal, reasonable resting state, just like men too, but it takes some time to return back. There's variation there too for men. I should point that out. Oh yeah, there we go. So erection loss begins for men. For some men, as the testicles descend and the penis goes back to its unstimulated state, the skin in the scrotum kind of becomes less tight, less taut, and the testicles descend away from the body. For some, there's a big difference, big window in difference of the refractory period for men too. So that's like before they become excited again, kind of sexually and responsive to stimulation. For some men, it's minutes. For other men, it's hours, and for some men, it's days, right? And so, there's variation there too. Don't feel bad. I mean, that's your physiology. Certain things are correlated, like age tends to take men longer as they get older, right? So even if they were younger and they had a really short refractory period, like, I'm ready to go again in like a few minutes, they get older, it tends to just get longer, with age. Other things that impact it greatly are health, right? So the better health you're in, typically the shorter those refractory periods are. For a lot of men though, they're like, I'm cool, I'm done, but not all men, right? So don't beat yourself up about that. If you want to do something to try to control it, there's not a whole lot you can do. Maybe, exercise and eat better diet. That'll help somewhat, right? Okay, let's look at some of the criticism of Masters and Johnson's stages. The criticism is weird to me, though, because they weren't making a psychological model. They're making a physiological model. So they're just talking about what happens in your body. They might expound a bit, like I said, because they were interested in the application of the information, because they wanted people to be able to talk about their bodies, right? So they're educators, right? I mean, I love them for that. I hear them, but so the criticism sounds weird. They're like, you didn't put in any of, the psychological and behavioral stuff. And it's like, well, yeah, they were focused only on the physiology. But we could also say, some of the criticisms are kind of general for stage theories. And I put too many, too few stages here up on the screen. it's kind of like criticism of stage theories on any topic. Like, are there too many stages? Are there not enough stages? Do you have to advance through one stage to get to another? Right? It's like you have to advance from stage 1 to get to stage 2 and then stage 3. Or is it possible to operate on multiple stages at once? So it's like the criticism of stage theories. I think about it as like old video games. You have to beat level 1 to get to level 2. You got to beat level 2 to get to level 3. It's like you have to advance in that order and only that order. And so some of the criticisms were, how do you know that you're not working on, like, I don't know, like the same kind of systems for orgasm as for excitation at the same time? And it's more like two bars ramping up simultaneously. All right, fair enough. I mean, you don't really, it's hard to know that. Some of the other criticisms were, what about, the things that are psychological, like the, sexual desire? Shouldn't that be part of the model? Um, and Masters and Johnson would say, oh, of course that's part of the experience, but it's not something that we were going to measure physiologically, right? And then the other is sex differences. So that's the weirdest one to me. Like, it's like people have been offended at different periods of time that there were like differences physiologically between men and women as they go through the sexual response cycle. Like, like equality must be so equal that our bodies are exactly the same. It's like they're pretty darn similar, but there's variation there. Still, there are some differences. Um, that's a weird one to me, since Masters and Johnson actually did study men and women and talk about, typically they look very similar, but there's more variation for women, kind of like across the board, right? On all topics of the sexual response cycle. And we'll find that on almost all topics of human sexuality as we go through our class. Like, if you're going to compare men and women, it looks like women tend to have more variation, which is interesting. Okay, so let's look at some of the other models that people have proposed since Masters and Johnson. And all of these, by the way, were like a reaction to Masters and Johnson's model. It was so profound for the sciences, both physical and behavioral, that you can see a lot of the same language, the same type of stages used in the models that came after Masters and Johnson, like this one, like Kaplan's. Right? You see like slightly different types of words used to label very similar phenomenon, like desire. Essentially, you have the excitement and plateau and orgasm, just like Masters and Johnson, but they put this desire stage in there up front at the beginning. And that's probably because, Kaplan had a psychology background, and Kaplan was a sex therapist, not a researcher. And so she had, a different approach. She was worried about people who had disorders of desire, where it wasn't like a physiological issue necessarily. They just didn't desire sex at all. Like, they didn't desire the excitement. So they wouldn't even begin that excitement stage. She thought that would change this EPOR model, and it needed to be part of the focus. It's like, okay, cool, fair enough, right? So, she'd focus on how we come to even want to have sex. Then after that we get excited, and then orgasm, and then recovery, right? So yeah, that's a fair criticism. I mean, you could add the psychological component to the beginning, kind of tack it on to the beginning of the physiological model. So here's the psychological, then you have the physiological afterward. Sure, right? I mean, if you think of those things as separate, we could say something like, from the study 1990, no, from a 2002 study, forgive me, I'm looking at my notes here, 30% of women just never experience like spontaneous sexual desire. That's a pretty wild thought. If you're a person that does, it seems like out of nowhere, you're just like, ooh, I'm horny, right? It was like 30% of women reported like just never feeling that sensation. Just didn't really happen. Like, they could become excited, right? But they never just went like, I'm excited now, right? Just kind of out of nowhere. And nearly all men could report feeling that, right? It can even be problematic, right? Like, oh, not right now, right? So she added the psychological component. Okay. Through her if we look at other work, like there's a study in 1994 where they looked at people that don't have any sexual desire, and they found that it was like upwards of 33% of women and like 17% of men. Those numbers have been criticized a lot since then, but there you go, right? So their problem wasn't just like their physiology; it was not even wanting to be excited, right? So that's interesting. So we might call that the psychological. Um, Now another one, another perspective, right? Another model is Reed's. He calls this the erotic stimulus pathway theory. It's an interesting one. You can tell that he basically, took the Masters and Johnson model and we kind of relabeled it and focused in on what he thought was important. And that's fair, right? So if you look over the left here, you see seduction, sensations, surrender. He was looking at this more from like a behavioral and evolutionary perspective. So he would focus on things like what are the behavioral scripts and expectations for sex. And his seduction phase is like similar-ish to, Kaplan's desire phase. But he was making the argument that seduction is part of the evolutionary game we play as humans, like where males kind of need to feel that they are chasing and females need to feel that they're being chased, like to some extent. Some males and females want to feel that to a larger extent than others. But that kind of helps, I think, might be like an evolutionary or biological basis for some of our behavioral scripts that we still have, that can really go awry and can lead to, non-consensual sexual situations, or even where it can lead to like it being acceptable for men to like not accept no as an answer, or a woman says, no, I'm not interested. And they're like, are you sure? And becoming like pestering into the point where it's harassment, right? That kind of thing. So it can go wrong for sure. But still, he would say the reason that exists as a strategy evolutionarily is because it often still works, which is, it feels like it's encouraging what I think of as like this could be bad behavior, from a moral standpoint from men, right? But that wasn't his goal. He was just saying like, if this is a behavioral strategy, it's around because it's been reinforced by everyone, men and women. It's been reinforced by us for years and years. But there's the seduction stage. Then after that, you have the sensations phase, sort of like the excitement phase. You're going through, all the stuff that starts to get you turned on, right? Physiologically and psychologically, and then you get to the surrender phase, where is ultimately will result in orgasm, and a kind of a lack of cognition is what people who like Reed's model focus on here. So I'd say at this stage, like it's almost like if you look at Masters and Johnson's ideas and the physiological recordings of the brain, what's occurring just prior to, during, and just after orgasm, like what part of the brains are active, what kind of chemicals are being secreted, right? Yeah, you do see this lack of cognition, this lack of thinking, this lack of aggressiveness, like all this kind of dissipates for men and women. And you kind of have to get out of the way and let that happen. And that's why it's called surrender, right? So kind of allow that lack of anxiety, the lack of thinking to occur. And then it might be easier for you to achieve orgasm. Interesting. And then there's next what he calls the reflection phase. And during this phase, Reed really thought like during the reflection phase, you could really tell if a couple is in a healthy sexual relationship by what they do during the reflection phase. So like if you immediately fall asleep, then he didn't think that was very healthy, as if you kind of cuddled up and talked to each other. So now we're bringing like the cognitive back in, back into your body, your thinking processes, your ability to communicate with each other. He thought that was really important for relationships in particular, to focus on that part of the phase. If you're just like, that was great, bye, I'm done. It's like, that's not going to either you don't want a relationship and that's okay, or if you do want a relationship, maybe that's not the best approach to take, and you can actually work on that and work on talking to each other and being kind of intimate during the reflection phase. Continue the intimacy, but allowing your thoughts, your cognition back in. So people like Kaplan and Reed were trying to develop models that would help them in their therapy with people who are having sexual problems. So I don't know. It's weird to say, I think, that they were critical in like a negative way of Masters and Johnson. I think they were just saying, hey, let's add, the psychological and behavioral into this physiological model to make it even more robust and more interesting. So I don't know. What do you think? Do you like these models? Would you add anything more to them? Would you subtract anything? I'd be curious to know your thoughts on that. If you want to put them in the discussion for the class or email them to me, that'd be cool. I'd like to hear from you. All right. I hope you enjoyed this chapter, and we will be back with the next one shortly. Bye, everyone.